No more pain. My ribs are already broken. She cried lonely. Rancher took her in, against whole west. The wind moved like a slow hand over the land, bending the dry grass and rattling the loose boards of the fence. The sky was pale, the kind of color that comes after a night frost, and the air smelled faintly of smoke from a neighbor's distant chimney. No sound but the creak of saddle leather as Luke Harlan guided his horse along the narrow dirt road that cut through his ranch. Luke had been up since before dawn, mending a water trough, checking the cattle. At 52, his days were measured by chores, not clocks. He liked it that way. Predictable, quiet, no one to answer to but the animals. The West had a way of stretching a man thin until all that was left was habit and bone. He was heading back toward the barn when he saw it, a shape by the fence line. At first, he thought it was just a tangle of burlap caught in the wire, but then it moved. Luke slowed his horse. The shape became clearer. A girl, maybe 19, sitting in the frost-bitten dirt with her knees drawn to her chest. Her hair was tangled, dark with dust, and her dress hung in torn pieces from her shoulders. Her arms were wrapped around herself, and her lips were cracked, the skin at the corner split and bleeding. She didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the ground, like she was afraid that lifting her head might invite trouble. Luke swung down from the saddle, the gravel crunching under his boots. "You hurt?" he asked, his voice low. Her answer was quiet, almost swallowed by the wind. "No more pain," she said. "My ribs are already broken." Something in him shifted, sharp and cold. Luke had seen pain before, in men at war, in cattle dying slow, but there was something about the way she said it, flat, final, like she wasn't asking for help, only telling him the limit of what she could take. He crouched down a few feet from her. There were bruises along her jaw, deep blue against pale skin. One of her shoes was missing, the other held together by twine. She smelled faintly of smoke and blood. From the hill beyond, the wind carried a faint sound, hoofbeats, far off but coming closer. Luke looked toward the horizon, then back at the girl. Her hands trembled, clutching her torn dress, as if she knew those hoofbeats better than he did. Something told him this was not a moment he could ride away from. Luke stood there longer than he meant to, his shadow stretching across the frost. The girl didn't flinch, didn't move, only kept her eyes fixed on the ground as though she'd made peace with being invisible. A man could walk away from that. Plenty did in the West. Folks said it wasn't their fight, not their problem. The land was big enough to bury the things you didn't want to see. But Luke wasn't made for pretending. He'd seen the same stillness once before, not in a stranger, but in his younger brother Daniel. It was years ago, in a muddy field in France after an artillery blast had thrown them both into a trench. Daniel's leg was gone. The blood was hot in Luke's hands, but his brother's eyes. They'd been cold, empty, like he'd already stepped out of the world. Luke had shouted his name, but the boy hadn't answered, only stared at the dirt until the medics pulled him away. He'd buried Daniel 2 days later. Now, standing here, Luke felt the same ache claw its way up his chest. The girl might as well have been Daniel in that moment, not in the body, but in the quiet surrender that lived in her eyes. She was still breathing, but she'd already let go. The hoofbeats in the distance came sharper now. Whoever was out there, they weren't drifting by. They were coming for her. "Do you got a place to go?" Luke asked. Her head shook once, barely. Then her gaze flickered to the road behind him, and he saw it. The smallest flinch, like the sound of those riders, was a knife in her ribs. She didn't speak again, but her fingers tightened on the hem of her dress until the knuckles went white. Luke's gut twisted. He knew exactly what was happening here. This wasn't just a lost traveler. This was a hunted thing. He glanced toward the barn, then toward the open plain. It would be easier to ride away. He could tell himself the law would handle it. He could convince himself she'd made her own choices. That's what most men did when trouble came wearing another man's shadow. But his mind betrayed him with another memory. A winter night, years after the war. A woman in town, running barefoot in the snow while her husband shouted behind her. Luke had been across the street, carrying a sack of feed. He hadn't crossed, hadn't lifted a finger. By morning she was gone, and he'd told himself it wasn't his business. That night still came to him in dreams, her breath fogging the cold air as she looked back over her shoulder, like she knew he could have stopped it. Luke spat in the dirt, the taste of iron in his mouth. He'd made enough mistakes to last a lifetime. He wasn't about to add one more. "Come on," he said finally, voice low but steady. He reached out a hand, not close enough to startle her, just there if she wanted it. She hesitated, then, with a trembling breath, let her fingers rest in his. They were cold as stone. Luke pulled her gently to her feet. The riders were closer now, the sound rolling over the plain. He didn't know what was waiting if he took her in, but he knew what would happen if he didn't, and he was done living with that kind of regret. Luke didn't rush her toward the barn. Instead, he led her into the shadow of the corral fence, keeping low, letting the boards hide them from the road. The hoofbeats grew louder. 3 horses, maybe 4. They rode with purpose, the kind of rhythm men used when they knew where they were going. The girl's breathing was uneven, each inhale catching like a loose hinge. Luke crouched beside her, watching the trail through a gap in the boards. 4 riders came into view, all in dust-brown coats, rifles slung across their backs. The man in front sat taller than the rest, his hat pulled low, a long scar running from his jaw to the corner of his mouth. They slowed near the fence line. The leader scanned the ground, eyes sharp as broken glass. When he spoke, his voice carried in the cold air. "She's close. She didn't make it far." The girl shrank into herself, her knees drawn tight. Luke glanced at her, the way her hands curled, the way her head tilted just enough for her hair to shield her face. She knew this man, knew him well. The riders moved on down the road, but not far. They stopped at a rise just beyond the property and lit cigarettes, their horses shifting under them, waiting, watching. Luke turned to her. "You going to tell me who they are?" She hesitated, then spoke so softly he had to lean in. "My uncle," she whispered, "and his men." Luke's jaw tightened. "What does he want?" Her lips trembled before she answered. "He says I owe him. Says my father did too. I worked the house, the fields. It was never enough. She stopped, swallowing hard. "He wants me back." Luke didn't need details. He'd seen enough men like that, ones who wore family like a chain, not a bond. Debt was just the excuse. Control was the prize. "Why the ribs?" Luke asked quietly. She didn't answer with words. Her eyes met his for the first time, a raw, unguarded look that told him more than he wanted to know. Whatever she'd lived under, it had been years in the making. He shifted, scanning the horizon again. The riders hadn't moved. They were patient, and patience meant danger. If they thought she was here, they'd wait until dark. Luke knew the law wouldn't help. Men like her uncle had friends in every dusty office between here and the state line, and out here, property lines didn't stop a man determined enough. "Listen," Luke said, his voice steady. "If they find you here, they'll find me too. That means we both got trouble now." She flinched. "I don't want to bring trouble." "You already did," he said, not unkindly. "But you're staying." A cold gust swept through, carrying the smell of cigarette smoke. Luke made up his mind. He'd get her inside, feed her, and figure the rest out after dark. For now, the priority was keeping her unseen. He guided her toward the barn, keeping to the shadows. With every step, the sound of horses shifting on the ridge reminded him they were on borrowed time. Inside the barn, the air was warmer, thick with the scent of hay and old wood. Luke guided her to a stack of blankets near the tack wall. She sat slowly, wincing as her ribs pulled against the movement. He didn't ask about the pain. Instead, he busied himself with small, practical tasks, filling a tin cup with water from the pump, slicing bread, cutting a wedge of cheese. When he handed it over, she took it without looking at him. Her hands trembled so much she nearly spilled the water, but she didn't complain. She ate in slow, careful bites, like she'd learned long ago to stretch whatever she was given. Luke sat opposite her, leaning against a post, the crackle of mice in the hay somewhere behind them. Neither spoke for a long while. The quiet felt like a truce. When she'd finished, Luke stood and fetched a small oil lamp, setting it on an overturned crate. He pulled an old rifle from the rack, checked the chamber, then handed it to her. Her eyes widened. "I don't—" "You will," he said simply. She held the weapon awkwardly, unsure where to put her fingers. Luke stepped behind her, his hands guiding hers, one on the barrel, one on the stock. Her shoulders were tense under his touch, but she didn't pull away. "Not about killing," he said. "It's about not being helpless." She nodded faintly, eyes fixed on the wood grain of the stock. Luke showed her how to rest it against her shoulder, how to line the sights, how to breathe before the squeeze. They didn't fire, the riders would hear, but the weight of the gun in her hands seemed to settle something in her posture. When she handed it back, Luke noticed her sleeve had slipped, revealing a thin line of scar along her forearm. He didn't ask. He just rolled up his own sleeve, showing a jagged mark that ran from wrist to elbow. "Wire fence, winter of '98, he said. "Snowstorm came in fast. I was trapped out there for 2 hours before my brother found me." Her gaze lingered on the scar, then shifted to his face. "I had a brother once," she murmured. "He left. Didn't say goodbye." Luke didn't press. He only gave a slow nod, letting the weight of her words sit between them. Later, as dusk slid across the land, Luke boiled coffee on a small stove in the corner. She sat nearby, legs drawn up, her eyes half closed from the heat. The smell of brewing coffee filled the barn, mingling with the soft rustle of hay. For a brief stretch of time, the world outside seemed far away. No riders, no danger, just the glow of the lamp and the steady rhythm of their breathing. Luke poured her a cup, and for the first time, she met his gaze without flinching. It wasn't trust yet, but it was something close. A crack in the wall she'd built. The peace wouldn't last. He knew it. She probably did too. But for this small slice of evening, they shared something fragile and unspoken, almost like family. The first sign was the dogs. 2 sharp barks from the yard, then a low growl that rolled through the barn like distant thunder. Luke set his coffee down, his eyes cutting to the girl. She'd gone still, cup halfway to her lips. Bootsteps crunched in the frost outside, slow, purposeful. Then came the voice, the same one he'd heard on the ridge. "Evening, Harlan. We're looking for something that belongs to us." Luke stepped toward the barn door, his rifle in hand. He didn't open it. Instead, he called back, "Ain't nothing in here of yours?" A dry chuckle floated through the wood. "She's my niece, Luke. Ran off in the night, left work unpaid and debts unsettled. Law says I got claim." Luke glanced at her. She was pressed against the wall, shaking her head in tiny, frantic movements. "I don't much care what the law says," Luke replied. "Not when it comes to a man who breaks a girl's ribs." The boots stopped just outside. "You think you can stand in my way?" the uncle said. Behind him, other boots shifted. 3 more men, all armed. Luke eased the door open a crack. The man's face was lit by the cold moon, the scar at his mouth deep in shadow. One of the men beside him rested a hand on the butt of his revolver. "This here's your last ask, Luke," the uncle said. "Step aside, or you'll be laid in the dirt next to her." Luke's grip tightened on the rifle. He'd been in standoffs before, in muddy trenches, in saloons where one wrong breath drew blood. This felt the same, only heavier. "Not tonight," Luke said. The uncle's smile faded. "So be it." One of the men shifted, ready to draw. And then Luke did something none of them expected. He stepped fully into the doorway, rifle raised, the barrel lined dead center on the uncle's chest. "You fire a shot on my land," Luke said, "and you better kill me with it. 'Cause if you don't, I'll put you in the ground before the smoke clears." The men hesitated, all but one. The youngest of them, couldn't have been more than 20, moved his coat aside, reaching for his pistol. The girl gasped. "Eli, don't!" she cried. The young man froze. His hand trembled at his side. Luke's eyes cut to her, and there it was. Recognition, not just fear. "That's your brother?" Luke asked, voice low. She nodded once, her face twisting in pain. The uncle smirked. "Boy's been helping me bring her home. Ain't that right, Eli?" Eli didn't answer. His eyes darted between Luke and the girl. His jaw worked, but no words came. Luke saw it then, the same flicker he'd seen in her eyes earlier. The war between what you were told to be and what you knew was right. "You can walk away from him now," Luke said to Eli, "or live with it the rest of your life." The air hung heavy for a beat. Then Eli's hand dropped away from the gun. He stepped back. The uncle's face hardened. "You just made a mistake, boy." "No," Luke said, shifting his aim back to the man with the scar. "The mistake was thinking she was yours to take." The standoff cracked. One of the uncle's men cursed under his breath. The uncle spat in the dirt, then jerked his reins. "This ain't over, Harlan." They turned their horses toward the road. disappearing into the frost. Luke lowered the rifle slowly, his heart pounding. He knew the man meant what he said. It wasn't over. But for tonight, she was safe, and he'd take that win, even if it cost him everything tomorrow. The night swallowed the sound of hooves until there was nothing left but the low hiss of the wind through the fence. Luke stood in the doorway, rifle hanging loose at his side, his breath clouding in the cold. The girl hadn't moved. She sat against the wall, arms wrapped around her ribs, watching him like she wasn't sure yet if the danger was gone. He stepped back inside, closing the door behind him. The barn seemed smaller now, the air thick with the scent of lamp oil and horse sweat. For a long while, they didn't speak. Luke poured water into a basin, set it beside her, and slid a clean rag onto the blanket. She took it without meeting his eyes, dipping it into the water and pressing it gently against her side. Her wince was sharp, but silent. Outside, one of the dogs barked once, then settled. Somewhere far away, an owl called. Luke moved to the stove, stoking the fire back to life. The orange glow spread slowly across the barn, touching the worn beams, the dust drifting in the air. He ladled soup into a tin bowl, set it down within her reach, then returned to his post against the far wall. She ate in small, careful spoonfuls. The quiet was not awkward. It was heavy, like both of them understood that words would only make the moment smaller. When she finished, she set the bowl aside and drew her knees up, resting her head against the wall. Luke watched her eyelids flutter shut. She was asleep before her next breath. He let her be. Instead, he stepped outside, standing in the yard with the rifle balanced in his hands. The moonlight silvered the frost, the land wide and empty in every direction. There was no sign of the riders now. But Luke knew men like that didn't give up. They simply waited for another opening. Still, something in him eased. Tonight at least she wasn't in their hands. He stayed there for a long time, the cold biting through his coat, the quiet pressing in like snow. When he finally went back inside, she hadn't stirred. He draped an old quilt over her shoulders, tucking it in at the sides so it wouldn't slip. Her face softened in sleep, the bruises fading into shadow. Luke sat in the opposite corner, leaning his back to the wall. He didn't plan to sleep, not until the sun came up. His eyes lingered on her small form under the quilt. She looked younger in sleep, fragile, but not broken. Not yet. The lamp flickered low. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of cedar from the ridge. Luke closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of what had just passed. The threat was gone, for now. But the promise the man with the scar had left behind would hang over them like a storm. Luke knew it. She probably did too. Still, as the first pale edge of dawn began to touch the horizon, he found himself holding on to a simple, stubborn thought. They had survived the night. Winter passed slow that year, as if the cold itself didn't want to leave. The days stretched long and quiet, broken only by the sound of chores, the creak of barn doors, the lowing of cattle. The girl, her name was Sarah, though she didn't speak it for weeks, moved about the ranch like someone learning the shape of a new world. Her ribs healed, though she still held herself carefully, like she feared sudden movement might undo the mending. Luke never pressed her for stories. In time, pieces slipped through. A name here, a memory there, but never more than she wanted to give. By spring, she could shoot well enough to hit a tin can at 50 yards. Luke taught her to ride, to mend fence wire, to set traps for foxes along the creek. He noticed her laughter first as a faint thing, barely there, then growing into something that could fill a room. It didn't happen often, but when it did, it stayed with him for days. The uncle never came back, though sometimes Luke spotted riders on the far ridge. They never crossed the fence line. Whether it was caution or patience, he couldn't say. Life settled into a rhythm, not quite peace, but close enough that they could breathe without looking over their shoulders every hour. One warm evening in early summer, Sarah came to him with a folded scrap of paper. It was a map, hand-drawn, the lines faint and uneven. "This is where my father's buried," she said. "Haven't been there since before." Luke saddled the horses, and they rode out at first light. The grave was small, marked only by a weathered stone, the name worn nearly smooth. Sarah knelt in the grass, her fingers brushing dirt from the edges. She stayed there a long while, saying nothing, her head bowed. Luke stood back, giving her the space he wished someone had given him once. When she rose, she placed a small river stone at the base of the marker. "That's for staying," she said softly. They rode home without hurry, the sun sinking low, the sky burning gold behind the hills. The air smelled of rain, though none had yet fallen. By the time they reached the ranch, the lamps were lit, and the dogs were already at the gate. Luke watched her lead her horse into the barn, her shoulders straighter than they'd been in the winter.